Okay, so currently we've got working code, but that might not always be the case, and we do need a way or a tool to help us see what's going on behind the scenes. So when our API controller, for instance, receives this request, then we'd like to know what's inside the registered ETO. What is our API controller receiving? What's going to happen at each point during this method, and what's it going to create, and does the functionality work? Obviously, we'd use this tool when we run into problems and we want to see what's happening behind the scenes. So inside VS Code, and this lesson is aimed at those of you using VS Code, but using a debugger is pretty much the same thing whatever IDE we are using, but the setup is going to be VS Code specific. So we've got an area, a tab over on the left hand side to debug our project, but to use this we need to create a launch.json file. So I'm just going to click the link here to create this file, and we're going to use the C# debugger. And this creates the boilerplate for a launch.json file. And it's contained inside our project folder. If we take a look at the dating app file, then we now have a .vs code folder with a launch.json file inside it. And inside this file, we can add a configuration using this button. And there's two options that we're going to add to this. We're going to add the one to attach to a .NET process, and we're going to add another configuration to launch a C# project. And in this case, we do need to adjust a couple of the settings here. So the name, I'm just going to change to API debug, C# API debug. And then we need the relative path to project folder API. And in this case, our workspace folder is going to be the dating app, and then we're going to launch the API project. So these are the two configurations that we need to run our debugger, but most of the time then we'll be using the attach, or at least this is my preference, is to attach the debugger to an already running process. Now for that one to work, of course, you need to have your API server actually running. If you try and attach it to a process that's not running, clearly that's not going to work. But this one here, the launch one, supposing for instance you wanted to check what's going on inside your program class, this is your startup code. When you've already started your app and your app is running, then this method has already been executed. And in order to debug code, we would typically add a breakpoint. And we could do that by clicking on the line of code, or to the left of the line of code, that we're interested in debugging. Now if we attach the debugger to a process that's already running, this method has already been executed and we cannot see what's happening inside there. But for the time being, then everything that we're doing, so long as our application starts up, then we can just attach the debugger to an already existing process. So let's take a look at our account controller. And let's say, for example, I wanted to see what was going on when we register a new user. Now I could put my breakpoint at the top of this method, next to the if statement, and when we run our debugger and we execute a request to this endpoint, then our code execution is going to stop on this line, and we can then see what is happening. So in order to start our debugger, or attach it to the process, we go to our Run and Debug tab, and then we've got our two different options. We can use API debug to launch the process, or we can select the one to attach it to a process. And I'm going to use this option. And then we hit play, and then we'll get a list of all of the processes that are running on our computer. Now there's a lot, but we're going to search for the API. This is the one that's running my API project. Now this does vary between operating systems. Maybe you need to look for .NET API if you're on Windows, for example, but in my case, then API is the name of the project, the name of the process that's running that I need to attach to. So I'm going to select API, and then our debugger should start, and we'll get some information here, and maybe we need to give this developer tools access and just put our password in like so, and click the take control button. And now our debugger is started. So let's clean up the windows here and just give myself some space. And if we go back to Postman, and let's just register a user that already exists, Dave in this case, and click Send. And what happens is our debugger has stopped on the breakpoint that we selected earlier. So let's see what we've got, what information we have inside our debugger on the left hand side. And we can see the variables inside this controller that we're working with. Now, because the account controller is a class, controller specific things are inside this. And if we take a look at this inside here, then we can see everything, and let's move those down as well. But we can see all of the different objects that we have available inside a controller class. We have things like the HTTP context. We have things like the model states, the request, the response, the root data. And when it comes to authentication, then we can get information about the user that is authenticating to this endpoint. So lots of useful information inside the controller where we access it by this. And then for the moment, let's take a look at what's inside the register DTO. And if we hover over the register DTO, we can see what its values are. So we've got a password and username, and we can see the password and we can see the username when we hover over this. And we can also see it on the left hand side by expanding the register DTO object. That's the first part where we've stopped our request on the breakpoint. And then we've got our controls over here. We've got the play option, which will continue on to the next breakpoint if there is one, or it's going to continue the request. We can also step over this line of code, and that will take us to the next line of code. Or we can step into or step out of the different methods inside the method that we're working on. So currently I'm checking to see if the user exists. And if I want to step into this method, then I'd need to use the step into, and this takes me to the user exists method, and then I can step over and it's going to execute this line of code. And if I step over that and step over again, it takes us back to the user exists. And now it's highlighting, although kind of difficult to see, but it's highlighting where this little arrow is, the next part of the request we're going to. And because the username is taken, then we're going to effectively return a bad request. So if I step over, then we go to the end, the closing bracket of this method, and step over again, and that's our request being returned to Postman, and we'll see in Postman the username is taken. So if I change the username to John, for example, a user that does not exist, and click send, then we're sending the request, and if I go back to the debugger, then we've once again stopped on the same line. But now we've got a different user, and if I hover over register, then we can see the password and the username inside there. Now if I step over the code, then I get taken to the using var hmac, and if I step over again, because currently this is null, but if I want to see what this is populated with, then I step over, and now hmac is populated with all of its functionality. And then we go ahead and create our new user object. So I'll step over this again, and then user is populated with what entity framework is going to create, and we can see our password hash and our password salt, and the username is John, and currently we do not have an ID because this has not yet been saved into our database. So if I step over again to the next line, we're about to execute the save changes. And when I step over this line, what we'll find is that we've now got an ID for our user because it has been saved into our database. And then if we just continue, then we've effectively created that new user in the database, and we get the output back in Postman. So we don't have anything to troubleshoot yet, but the debugger is an excellent tool so that we can see internally what's going on with our method. We can see what the values are in the register DTO. When it comes to authentication, we'll see the details about the user that's authenticated inside the user objects that's part of our API controller. So it's a useful tool. It's another tool in the toolbox. Please do experiment with this. Please do use this when you want more details about what's going on inside your code. and just get used to practicing using it at various points in this training course. And please use it when you do run into a problem so that you can see what's happening with the request, certainly from the API perspective, and see what's happening inside there. So that's just a brief introduction to the debugger. We can detach the debugger by clicking the disconnect button there, and we don't need that breakpoint in here either, so I'll just clean that up as well. So now that we've got the ability to register a user, next we're going to take a look at logging in.